And joining us now on The Debate in Washington, D.C., Dr. Helen Caldicott, author of Nuclear Power is Not the Answer. In Ottawa, Steve Aplin, an energy consultant. Here in our studios, Duncan Hawthorne, president of Bruce Power, and Dave Martin, the energy coordinator for Greenpeace. And a reminder that we always like to get you involved in the program on Thursdays, so email us your questions to theagenda@tvo.org, and we'll try to get as many of them on the air as we can. And please respond to our poll question as well, which we just put up, whether or not you approve of nuclear power in the province. Just before we, first of all, welcome everybody, and just before we get our debate started, a little history here. It was last June when this announcement was made, the Liberal government deciding to expand nuclear power generation in the province, first time in decades. Energy Minister Dwight Duncan saying that this may mean more than just fixing the reactors that this province has now. Most observers believe we will be building more nuclear reactors soon. It's just a question of where. And if you want to see how we do our power in this province, let's bring up this next chart if we could, Michael, and you will see that, in fact, nuclear is the #1 source of energy in Ontario today. We get 34% of our electricity generation from nuclear, 24% from hydroelectric, coal comes in at 20%, gas and oil at 17%, and the things that we need to do way more of, renewables at 4% only, conservation only 1%, those numbers according to the Ontario Power Authority. The government seems to have made a decision that we're going to go more into nukes in this province. Dr. Helen Caldicott, what do you think of that idea?
From a medical perspective, it's absolutely unacceptable. You know, a nuclear power plant contains as much long-lived radiation as that produced by the explosion of 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. And the cooling pools beside the reactors contain twice to 30 times as much radiation as in the reactor core itself. If you have a meltdown in Ontario, either terrorist-induced, which is possible, or an accident, you will have very little power because your nuclear power plants will be closed down. The investment in your uranium mining will stop, and many power plants around the world will close. And what's more, hundreds of thousands of people could be dying of acute radiation illness and cancers years later.
Okay, so let me get Duncan Hawthorne to react to that.
Nuclear power from a medical perspective.
Just stand by, hold that thought for a second, because I got 4 people here and I want to manage the time properly. Could you respond to the comment she just made?
Yeah, well, it's a familiar story, Steve. You know, the reality is that this alarmist rhetoric is something that, you know, we're used to hearing, but the truth is that we here in Canada have nuclear power for 40 years. We've had plants that have operated safely, reliably, and you know, the numbers you talk about, more than 50% of Ontario's energy last year was provided by nuclear power and has been for a long number of years, safely, reliably. You know, you can always alarm people by suggesting terrorists, and you know, there's no doubt that since 9/11, the environmentalist lobby have sought to scare people by suggesting that there is a massive threat from nuclear installations, and it's just frankly not true.
Maybe
David
people
Martin?
should be
Alarmist
scared.
rhetoric is what he's called it, David Martin.
Well, I think the McGuinty government has made a really disastrous decision to go nuclear, and there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, one is high cost. There's a $40 billion price tag to this proposal. It's not clean, as the nuclear industry would suggest. I mean, not only are there radiation releases to air and water, but we've got 30,000 tons of high-level radioactive waste from these reactors in Ontario that we don't know what to do with, and it's going to be toxic for a million years.
Patrick Moore says 90% of that could be recycled.
That is another big fat lie from Mr. Moore. Nuclear power is not safe either. I mean, there is a very real, a small probability, but a real risk of a catastrophic accident. The probability is small, but the consequences would be enormous.
Okay, Steve Aplin, come on in from Ottawa and give us your view on this.
I think that if we're serious about air emissions, air pollution, greenhouse gases, then we have to go nuclear in Ontario. If you look at the performance of the power sector since 2003, we've had emission reductions of about 15 million tons. This is something that doesn't get mentioned all that often, certainly not by people who oppose nuclear, but that's the biggest reduction since we signed Kyoto. It's by far the biggest reduction since we signed Kyoto.
Steve, do you not have any concerns about nuclear at all?
Not that much. I think that what Dr. Caldicott referred to earlier is a bit of hyperbole. I've driven by the Pickering, Darlington plants numerous times with all that Hiroshima waste inside them. I feel just fine. So do all the hundreds of thousands of people who drive by them.
Could you speak to that, Dr. Caldicott? Because while you may be accurate, of course, in laying out the worst-case scenario, the industry does say that the worst-case scenario has never happened, and they don't expect it ever to happen.
Well, it has happened, actually. It happened in Chernobyl, and right now 40% of the European landmass is still radioactive and will remain so for some hundreds of years.
I was referring to North America, of course.
And well, I mean, we had one in 3 Mile Island. If you read my book, that was a meltdown, and they did have a hydrogen explosion. Luckily, they contained most of it, but quite a lot of radiation got out. But because you haven't had one, a major one yet, doesn't mean to say that you will not. And in medicine, you can't ever say about a patient, because they're well now, it doesn't mean to say they won't get disastrously sick, number one. Number two, the waste. Nuclear power is a cancer-producing industry whose transient byproduct for about 30 years is the production of electricity by boiling water. What it really makes is massive quantities of radioactive waste, and Patrick Moore is wrong. They can't store it in glass, it devitrifies, the plutonium leaks out. Patrick Moore is wrong. Recycling plutonium is a hell of a dangerous thing. They're fast reactors, read about it in my book, fueled by up to 15 tons of plutonium, cooled by liquid sodium. You can't imagine a more dangerous industry. And what we will see, well, we'll be dead, but the legacy we leave to our descendants is epidemics of leukemia and cancer, particularly in children who are so radiosensitive, radioactive food, and epidemics of genetic disease, of which there are 16,000 now described.
Okay, let me jump in here because we've got an email that's come in on this topic as well, and Duncan Hawthorne, I'll get you to react to it. In addition to Helen Caldicott's comments, we have this email saying, given that our nuclear waste strategy involves shrugging our shoulders and passing the mess on to future generations, how can we, with clear conscience, describe nuclear as an environmentally sustainable solution?
Well, I think there's two answers to it. You know, clearly I don't agree about the risk. Not because I want to shrug my shoulders and forget. We have a duty of care for nuclear spent fuel. Of that there is no doubt. The industry takes that very seriously. How do we deal with that? Well, we clearly store it. It's very visible where it is on the site right now. People can see the controls. We're a highly regulated industry. We have to meet very, very strict standards on that duty of care. And there is a long-term solution for that. Other countries have already developed a long-term solution. Patrick Moore talks about reprocessing, but other countries such as Finland and Sweden have indeed constructed long-term facilities where we actually... But Canada has consulted with, across country. The Nuclear Waste Management Organisation have published a document which identifies paths forward, paths that are sponsored by Canadians.
And there's still no decision on it.
Well, whether there's a decision or not, the federal government have before them a credible proposal to construct a long-term store facility. It's been consulted widely by all Canadians, and this is the consensus view.
Okay.
Well, radioactive waste is toxic for 1 million years. It's being called thalidomide forever for a good reason. I want to address the climate change issue, though. There was a claim here that nuclear power is the solution to climate change. I think this is really the Trojan horse kind of strategy for the nuclear industry to get them through the gate. The reality is, though, if you look at real history in Ontario, the reason why greenhouse gas emissions doubled in Ontario in the last half of the 1990s was because the nuclear power plants were operating so poorly. They had to be shut down. 8 out of the 20 reactors had to be shut down in 1987 because of safety problems and poor performance.
But you just saw that report.
2 of them are shut down permanently, and 2 of them are still shut down at Mr. Hawthorne's plant.
But you just saw the report that came out the other day saying the worst point source in the whole country for pollution is Nanticoke, right? The coal-fired generating station there.
Absolutely, and I'm not defending coal either.
You're not defending coal?
Absolutely not.
That's not your alternative.
We have alternatives. The alternatives are green energy, it's renewables, it's conservation and efficiency, it's high-efficiency natural gas.
Can you keep auto manufacturing plants open on renewables and that kind of thing?
We have a vast resource in this province that we've had for a long, long time. It's called Niagara Falls and the other big hydraulic institutions. And I'll take you back to your own graph. 24% hydraulic and another 4% of other renewables. That's 28%. You stack that up against nuclear, which is slightly over 30%, and you begin to understand.
Okay, Steve Appleton, come on in. I can see you trying to get in.
I think nuclear is more like 54%, but I don't want to quibble about the numbers. The fact is, we're not going to plug a 1,000, 10,000 megawatt gap with the renewables that you're talking about. We've tapped out large scale hydro, and we're not going to. Let's take Nanticoke. We're not going to replace it with wind farms, for example. We would need something like 7,700 1.5 megawatt wind turbines to replace Nanticoke's 2003 output.
You know what the wind potential in Ontario is?
I'm sure it's phenomenal, but we're not putting 7,700 windmills the size of Boeing 747s.
There's over 50,000 megawatts of wind potential in Ontario.
Then go and put it up and get Hydro One to pay for the rights of way for all the transmission lines.
We're working on it, but if you pay $40 billion for nuclear plants, that's money that's not going to be invested in clean, green, cheaper, more reliable alternatives.
It will bring us back to the 1994 proportion of electricity generation, where we were well below the eventual Kyoto target.
Let me get Duncan Hawthorne on this. I have heard this suggestion in the past that of the $40 billion that has been estimated that we'll have to spend in order to build new nuclear facilities in the province, why don't we take that $40 billion and spend it in a different way to obviate the need for those plants? Is that possible? And still keep the lights on, obviously?
No, it isn't. I mean, the reality is conservation is absolutely something we should do. More investment in wind and solar and new technologies, absolutely we should do that, Steve, but we can't ignore just the basic need for energy that we have. One thing we know for certain, and surely we can agree on, is that every year we have a harsh winter and a hot summer. These things happen, and you need a plentiful supply of energy to meet those needs, and that comes from high-level concentrated power, be it coal, be it nuclear, but it has to be something of that magnitude. It is not going to be wind farms.
Right, let me go to Helen Caldicott in Washington. If nuclear is not your option of choice, which it clearly is not, what alternatives do you suggest? And keeping in mind that this is a highly industrialized province that needs not only to keep the lights on, but to keep hundreds of thousands of people employed in car manufacturing plants and that kind of thing.
Yes, I'm putting together currently a roadmap for a carbon-free, nuclear-free future, which will see the end of carbon dioxide production by the year 2050 and the nuclear power plants all phased out. And it's easy to do with alternative forms of energy. The money's there, which is currently being poured into nuclear power, which is absolutely inefficient. If you've got so much wind in Ontario, you can employ hundreds of thousands of people making those windmills, constructing them, putting them up, and producing wonderful clean energy. You can probably produce solar energy too, even in the winter in Ontario, because you get a lot of sun. You can in Boston. Geothermal energy is absolutely available for heating houses. Architects have to play a major role now in building efficient buildings and houses and industries. In other words, it's absolutely doable, and we've put all the numbers together to have a carbon-free, nuclear-free future by the year 2050, and maybe that's not fast enough with the rate that global warming is going.
Just want to make sure I heard you. Is it 2050 or 21.5 you're saying? What year?
2050. 2050. 2050.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Let me bring something up here if I could, Dr. Caldicott.
And it's coming out in April.
Let me just.
Can I just say how you can get the roadmap?
Go ahead.
At the end of April, you can go to my webpage, nuclearpolicy.org. We've done all the numbers and figures. We're going to Congress tomorrow to meet with senators and congressmen who head the energy committees. If we get the funding, we'll be well along the way for all these renewable energies,
okay.
Which at the moment, the US government nor the Canadian government is funding.
I honestly wish we had, 10 hours to discuss this. We got a half an hour. So
I do too.
So I do want to put this chart up, though, because I want our viewers to get some better understanding of what's at stake here and what we're talking about. Here again, numbers according to the Ontario Power Authority. Who's using power in the province? 40% of the electricity consumption is used in residential, 37% by commercial, institutional, 29% by industrial and agricultural. And what are we talking about here? Flip it over, Michael. We'll get the next board up. Primary metal manufacturing, paper manufacturing, chemical manufacturing. This is all heavy manufacturing. Wood product manufacturing, food manufacturing. We go on, transportation, petroleum, plastics, fabricated metal products, and so on. We're talking about heavy, heavy-duty manufacturing in this province of Ontario. And, David, the question persists, because I've never heard anybody outside of the environmental movement say, oh, yes, we can keep the lights on and keep all these people working at all of these plants by doing it with conservation and renewables. I've never heard anybody say it.
All of those plants have a fabulous resource. They can do cogeneration, what's also called combined heat and power. So instead of wasting the process heat, use it to generate electricity, use that heat in industry, you double your bang for the buck, you reduce your emissions, and you eliminate the need for more big centralized coal or nuclear plants.
Going to have job losses? Will that cause jobs?
It's going to create jobs. These are green jobs for Ontario.
We know that's nonsense, Steve. You said yourself.
How do you know it's nonsense?
Because you said it very clearly yourself. Businesses are smart people. If it was possible for them to reduce their costs and operate more efficiently, they would be doing it today. Any businessman,
not if they're given subsidized
running
electricity from the utility.
Anyone running a company.
Well, he makes a point here. If you're charging 5.7 cents a kilowatt hour instead of what it costs to make, or even more than that.
Paying the real
Steve,
cost.
when we talk about the real cost, I actually am a private sector company. I am charging the real cost.
You're a private sector company with a sweetheart deal,
and
you've been the lead.
David, you can't yell at him, okay?
When we talk about this
here.
$40 billion of investment, we can make that $40 billion of investment within the industry and still make the power at a price that is affordable to those companies, those very companies you mentioned. The difference here is, I agree with the introduction of wind. I agree with the pursuit of solar and alternative technologies, but they are all significantly more expensive. And yes, you can put money into them and hope to reduce the cost of them, but today we need the energy and we need to do it in an affordable way.
Who should pay to build the new nuclear reactors?
Well, obviously I have my own view. I think, you made the point about Darlington, great example. Do we want to take that risk in the public sector or do we want to transfer it to the private sector? Now, obviously my view would be, that's a business for the private sector.
Steve Applin,
can take that risk.
Steve Applin, who should pay for new nuclear reactors in this province, which you would like to see built?
I think that the government has a major role, and I'm talking about the federal government, but to spur private sector investment in the plants. It could emulate what the U.S. government has done, which is to introduce power production tax credits, a range of incentives like that, construction delay insurance, loan guarantees, that have really spurred a wave of new nuclear build in the United States. So I think that the federal government could take that sort of role here in Ontario. And if it works out to the federal government providing money to the Ontario government to build new CANDU reactors, for example, then so be it. We could rejig the fiscal system so that we acknowledge that it's Alberta money that's paying for this.
But it always comes down to government support for nuclear power.
So what?
So what? It's taxpayers' dollars. Why should we be subsidizing expensive, dangerous, dirty technology?
I'm already paying for that.
Mr. Hawthorne's company, by the way, has a sweetheart deal with the Ontario government that relieves them of all responsibility for radioactive waste. And they give him long-term contracts for the electricity.
And my power costs 13 cents a kilowatt hour, which is pretty reasonable for me. I paid $4.12 on my last power bill for the Darlington
And it'd be a lot less if we hadn't invested in nuclear power in Ontario and paid $14.5 billion for the Darlington nuclear plant.
In those 2 months for which I paid the $4.12 for the Darlington overrun, Darlington offset 5 million tons of greenhouse gases. Is that worth it? To me, it is.
It didn't offset
Yes, it did.
that amount of greenhouse gas, because if we had invested in the renewable technologies and the conservation technologies and even high-efficiency gas,
okay, but we didn't.
We wouldn't have been burning twice as much coal from 95
we would
to
have burned
2000.
coal. The reality is we would have burned coal.
Sorry,
so it offset,
we wouldn't have.
Yes, we would have. It would have. It offset 5 million tons of
There is
coal
one
emissions.
thing. I do need Duncan Hawthorne to speak to this, and that is if there is a nuclear accident in one of your plants and your company is at fault, the public pays to fix it. Why is that?
Well, obviously, the legislation that's created in Canada has a Nuclear Liability Act, Steve. It's the same in many countries. The Canadian situation is there's a cap on that liability. Personally, I believe that needs to be revisited. We have said that we believe it needs to be revisited. It's a very low number for the off-site release. We have to deal with on-site cleanup, etc. That's our responsibility.
Will you support us in our petition to the federal government to re-examine the Nuclear Liability Act, Mr. Hawthorne?
I have been before. I have been before Senate.
He hasn't done it.
I absolutely have. See, this is the problem with misinformation. I absolutely said that I believe it to be inadequate. And the reason I lobby for it is I'm a private sector company. When investors come along, they want to know what that legislation looks like. We want to have certainty. I have positively gone there and said it has to at least be $600 million. That's what's before the federal government for consideration, in the same way as before the federal government is a proposal on nuclear waste.
Okay,
we are not an irresponsible group.
I got a new email here. Somebody emailed, and here, let's get them an answer. How much waste is produced by one nuclear power plant in a year? How much waste, in brackets CO2, is produced by a coal plant, which generates the same amount of energy as a nuclear plant in 1 year? Steve Applin, you got any ideas on that?
Nanticoke produced, well, the combined coal assets of Ontario last year, according to the IESO, the Independent Electricity System Operator, produced 25 million tons.
25 million tons of CO2 produced by the coal-fired generating stations.
By the coal-fired generating station.
And how much by nuclear plants?
How much what by nuclear
CO2,
plants?
zero, right? Doesn't that impress
No,
you
it's
at all?
not zero.
Sorry,
It's
Helen
not
Caldicott,
zero.
go ahead.
No, because nuclear power plants don't stand alone. You have to mine millions of tons of uranium using fossil fuel. You have to mill it and crush it. You have to enrich it.
Understood,
so
but as Patrick
you've got
Moore
to
mentioned at the
include the amount of CO2.
Sure, you have to
and the amount of CO2 that's used to transport radioactive waste and store it for 500,000 or 1 million years.
I
That's
think
not
the life cycle is just ahead of wind, according to a number of studies that I've looked at. The nuclear energy life cycle.
There are other studies that say, at the moment, there's a study which says a nuclear power plant produces 1/3 the amount of CO2 as a similar sized gas-fired plant, but as the quality of uranium declines in the ore, within 10 or 20 years, because of all the fossil fuel going in to produce the fuel for nuclear power, you'll have the same amount of CO2 coming out of a nuclear power plant as a gas-fired
I don't
plant.
buy
So you
that.
may as well just burn the fossil
Well,
fuel.
let me hear.
No
Let me hear
radioactive-
from. Hang on, everybody.
I haven't finished.
Just a minute. If I
haven't finished.
But you've made an allegation that I want to
please.
get somebody in the business to respond to. I think that's
But
only fair.
I just said you may as well burn fossil fuel. At least you won't have radioactive waste. Who's going to pay for the illnesses and epidemics and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of cases of malignancy, particularly in children, and genetic disease for thousands of generations? You're not including that in the cost of nuclear electricity, and you should
the allegation. Okay, the allegation is that at the end of the day, the CO2 emissions from nuclear power are going to be just as bad as coal-fired generating stations.
Clearly nonsense. The nuclear cycle, even if we take it end to end, including your manufacturing and all of those things, is reckoned to be around 2%. Which, you know, when you talk about, what do you mean it's not right? There's all kinds of factual information to support that. There's reports. What you advocate to make your argument is a significant decline in the quality of uranium ore, and then form some dubious calculation to make it sound
what you're
like a number.
advocating is
There
This
is no,
calculation
there
is not
one
dubious.
set
of environmental problems for another.
To here, Dave. Just give
It's
me a
not
second.
dubious.
You've had a
well,
second.
the reality is that there is no uranium ore deficiency. There is no suggestion that we're going to mine less plentiful and less quality ore. It's just simply not true. And you extrapolate all of your information to create an alarmist rhetoric, which was my initial comment
That's not true.
to
I'm
your
not
first
an alarmist.
statement.
I'm
Absolutely,
a physician
you are.
Let's hear
dealing
from
with
Dr.
data. If all electricity today was generated by nuclear power, there's only 9 years' supply of uranium left in the world.
Nonsense.
It's a very finite supply. My data comes from a very excellent study. Read my book. The first chapter deals with
the last
nuclear
book I'll
power
be
and
buying
global
will be
warming.
yours. The last book I will buy will be one you've written, because there are no facts
Just
in
curious,
it.
what is the
There are no
source? Hang
facts
on,
in it.
I need to know. What is the source of the statement you just made, Dr. Caldicott, where you said if all our power was nuclear generated, we'd have 9 years left of uranium in the world?
9 years' supply in the world. It comes from Storm Van Willem and Philip Smith from Holland. Philip Smith is an American. He's since died, who've done a wonderful life cycle analysis of the nuclear industry from a CO2 and energetic perspective. I would invite you to read it. Read my chapter, go to the reference, and critique it, please. It has been critiqued on numerous occasions, and the figures stand. So go and work it out. Nuclear industry only deals with little bits of its life cycle. It doesn't take the whole
Steve,
thing
Okay,
from
Duncan
uranium
Hawthorne,
mining
there are
to storing
There are
of waste.
27 nuclear plants being built in the world right now. We've already heard there are 442 in operation. There are 28 currently going through planning permission in the world right now, and there's an estimation of 100 new nuclear plants worldwide in the next 15 years.
So what are the
Everyone is wrong. Everyone
David
has...
Martin,
What does that mean?
what do these governments know that you don't
What
know?
does that mean?
I think that there's an ethical question here. And aside from what you think the CO2 emissions from nuclear plants will be, and clearly there are some, it's a debate of how much, but there's an ethical question as well. Is it fair to exchange one set of environmental problems, radioactive waste that's lasting 1 million years, against greenhouse gas emissions? I don't think so, if there is an alternative. And there are alternatives, and
Okay.
that is, I think, the
Dave, let me put
salient
this to you.
point to make.
Let me put this to you, because we just got an email in here saying, is there a basic difference in design between the Canadian CANDU design and the nuclear designs in the USA and Chernobyl. And apropos of that question, okay, hang on, apropos of that question, a year ago, an organization that Dave Martin was associated with wanted to observe the 20th anniversary of the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl by reminding Canadians that such an accident could happen here. Do you think that was a responsible thing to say?
Absolutely. The CANDU reactor has something quite unique in common with the Chernobyl-type reactor. It's called the positive void coefficient. I know it sounds a bit technical, but in the absence of coolant, it can actually heat up.
So you think Chernobyl could happen here?
There's no question. It's a low probability. I'm not trying to be alarmist. It's an extremely low probability.
Because it's the lead of your press release. If you're not trying to be alarmist, that's a funny place to put that information.
We have said repeatedly and acknowledged that the chance of a catastrophic accident is extremely low probability. But if it does happen, and it certainly can happen, the consequences would be too horrible to imagine.
Would you acknowledge that it's possible?
As I said right from the beginning, Steve, we have a duty of care for this technology. We are highly regulated. Our designs are such that we have a lot of defence in depth. And my contention is we have lots of years of operating experience to demonstrate that we operate a very safe industry. Is there a duty of care requirement?
We use the same argument in medicine and in surgery. Duty of care, we're very safe, we've got a good record. I tell you what, you can never predict what an individual patient will do or their prognosis. And
but what do you do to deal?
Because you're dealing with human fallibility.
To be constructive with you, to give you a constructive comment, what do you do in those cases? You rely on a design, you rely on highly trained and qualified staff, you rely on very strong regulatory environment to ensure standards.
Do you think the CANDU design is better than the other ones?
It's different, Steve. All of the designs are different. Some of them pros and cons. You know, the one thing that Dr. Haldicott fails to recognise is much of our stuff about spent fuel pools, etc., is in relation to US designs, which use enriched uranium fuel. CANDU plants use natural uranium fuel. So the amount of energy in the fuel pre and post use in the reactor is very different.
Okay, I got to jump in here. Hang on, forgive me.
I got
to jump in. Forgive me,
pure plutonium.
We're just about out of time. I got enough time to take a quick. Hang on, Dr. Caldicott. Hang on. I got time enough only to look at the results of our web question, because we did ask people at the beginning of this program, are you in favor of nuclear energy? People logged onto our website, and here's what they had to say. Those who said yes, you going to put some numbers up, guys? 54% said yes, they were in favor of nuclear power. 46% said no. For what it's worth, that's what our viewers had to say tonight. Okay, let me thank Dr. Helen Caldicott in Washington, D.C. for joining us on the program this evening. Steve Applin in the nation's capital. Dave Martin, Duncan Hawthorne here in Toronto. Good to have you alongside.